The briefing room fell silent when General Marcus Hawthorne said it. Not the respectful silence that follows orders, but the hollow kind that precedes grief. Captain Vera Constantin is lost. His voice carried no doubt, no hope, just the flat certainty of a man who'd made this announcement too many times before. Outside, the Afghan sun hammered down on Bagram Airfield while maintenance crews stood motionless beside empty hardstands. Someone had already removed her name placard from the ready room wall. 3 hours earlier, her A-10 Thunderbolt II had vanished from radar during a close air support mission in the Korangal Valley. No ejection beacon, no mayday call, just static where her voice should have been, followed by the terrible mathematics of fuel exhaustion and gravity. The valley was a graveyard of helicopters and hopes, its steep walls lined with caves that had swallowed better pilots than her. Taliban fighters knew every ridge, every shadow. Search and rescue had called off the mission after taking heavy fire. The bird was gone. She was gone. But Hawthorne hadn't known Vera Constantin the way her squadron did. Hadn't known why they called her Thorn, not for her last name, but for what she'd carved into the war. He saw her personnel file, decorated but difficult, brilliant but abrasive. A former enlisted crew chief who'd clawed her way through officer candidate school, while her male peers questioned whether she belonged in a cockpit at all. What he didn't see were the late nights she'd spent in the hangar, learning every rivet and hydraulic line of the Warthog until she could strip it blind. He didn't know about the fuel pump she'd replaced with a Leatherman and wire during a forward deployment when maintenance said it couldn't be done. He didn't know that her father had died in an agricultural plane crash when she was 12, and that she'd been chasing his ghost through the sky ever since, trying to prove that Constantin hands could bend metal to their will, could make the impossible land safely. The other pilots knew, though. Captain Jake Morrison sat in the back of the briefing room, jaw tight, remembering how she'd talked him through a hydraulic failure over Kandahar when he was a lieutenant fresh from Florida. Lieutenant Amy Reeves stared at her boots, thinking about the insurgent mortar Team Vera had destroyed 3 weeks ago, the one that would have turned their forward operating base into a crater. They knew what Hawthorne didn't, that Vera Constantin didn't quit, didn't surrender, didn't die easy. But knowing and hopping are different currencies in war, and hope was a luxury none of them could afford. Not with the Taliban likely celebrating another American tail number, another name for their propaganda. Not with the sun setting over mountains that kept their secrets. The general dismissed them with standard words about honor and sacrifice. Protocol demanded 24 hours before declaring her officially KIA. 24 hours to process paperwork, to notify next of kin, to erase her from the roster. No one expected her to fill those hours with anything but silence. Then the radio crackled. It wasn't her voice at first, just a broken transmission that could have been atmospheric interference or equipment malfunction, the kind of ghost signal that makes controllers sit up straight and hold their breath. The tower at Bagram had heard it before, echoes of the dead, frequencies haunted by calls that would never be answered. But this signal had a rhythm to it, a pattern that refused to be random. 3 short bursts, pause, 2 long, pause, 3 short again. Someone in the tower recognized it immediately, not words but intention. Morse code, the ancient language of desperation, hammered out on whatever transmit button still functioned. The controller's hand trembled as he keyed his microphone. Unidentified aircraft, Bagram Tower, authenticate. Static answered him, thick and malevolent. Then the pattern repeated, more insistent this time. Another controller pulled up the squadron frequencies, scanning for her tactical call sign. Hog 23, Bagram Tower, how copy? Nothing. The pattern again, 323. Someone grabbed the code sheet, fingers moving down columns of letters until they found it. TOR Thorn. Vera Constantin's call sign, transmitted by someone who couldn't speak but refused to stay silent. The tower erupted. Controllers shouted coordinates, scrambled frequencies, tried to establish two-way communication. The general appeared in the doorway, drawn by the commotion, his face carved from stone and doubt. "Get me visual confirmation," he ordered. "I want eyes on whatever's transmitting." 2 F-16s were already spooling up, their pilots running through pre-flight checks with the frantic energy of men chasing miracles. Morrison was one of them, strapping into his cockpit while crew chiefs yanked chocks and waved him forward. The sun was dying now, bleeding red across the Hindu Kush, and somewhere in that vastness was a signal that shouldn't exist. The fighters went vertical, afterburners painting contrails against the darkening sky. Morrison's radar swept the valleys and ridgelands, searching for a ghost. His wingman flew loose formation, scanning visually, both men knowing that finding a single aircraft in this terrain was like finding a bullet in an ocean. But the signal kept pulsing, kept insisting, kept refusing to die. Hog 2-3, this is Viper lead. If you can hear me, continue your transmission pattern. Morrison's voice was steady despite the hammering in his chest. The signal strengthened and his radar caught something, low, barely above the valley floor, moving at a speed that seemed impossible. Too slow for controlled flight, too fast for a crash. His wingman saw it first, a shape silhouetted against the dying light, and what came through the radio was a whisper that sounded like prayer. Jesus Christ. The A-10 Thunderbolt II was never meant to be beautiful. Its designers called it the Warthog for good reason. Ugly, brutal, built around a gun that could chew through tanks. But what Morrison saw in that moment transcended aesthetics and entered the realm of myth. The aircraft was flying impossibly, with its entire left wing sheared off past the hardpoint. Where there should have been metal and control surfaces, there was only naked structural spar and torn hydraulics streaming fluid like arterial blood. The remaining wing struggled to generate lift, forcing the aircraft into a constant right bank that she somehow corrected with rudder and throttle, flying at an angle that would have killed anyone else. The fuselage was stitched with bullet holes, the canopy spiderwebbed with cracks. One engine was dark, its turbine blades visible through a hole in the nacelle. The landing gear hung partially extended, damaged hydraulics leaving it neither up nor down. And through the shattered canopy, barely visible in the fading light, was Vera Constantin, still flying her dying bird home. Morrison formed up beside her, close enough to see her face. Blood matted her hair where her helmet had cracked. Her oxygen mask hung loose, dangling from one hose. But her eyes were locked forward with an intensity that bordered on religious, and her hands moved across the controls with the precision of someone who'd merged completely with the machine. She saw him, gave a slight nod, the only acknowledgement she could manage, and kept flying. No other pilot could have done it. The A-10 was famous for its survivability, designed to absorb punishment and keep fighting, but this transcended engineering. This was will made manifest, skill pushed beyond its theoretical limits, a woman who'd promised her aircraft she'd bring it home and meant to keep that promise even if it killed her. Morrison keyed his radio. Bagram Tower, Viper lead. You're not going to believe this, but Hog 2-3 is inbound. He paused, searching for words adequate to the moment. She's missing her left wing. Repeat, the entire left wing is gone. She's flying on rudder and throttle alone. The silence that followed lasted 3 heartbeats. Then the tower erupted into coordinated chaos. The crash crews launched, foam trucks racing toward the runway. Medical teams scrambled to their positions. The general stood in the tower, watching his screens with an expression that mixed awe and horror in equal measure. Someone asked the question everyone was thinking. How the hell is she keeping that thing in the air? No one had an answer that made sense. The physics didn't work. The math said she should have spiraled into the mountains 90 miles back, but Vera Constantin had never been good at accepting what the math said. Morrison stayed on her wing, talking her through the approach even though she couldn't respond. Her radio was gone, destroyed by the same burst of anti-aircraft fire that had taken her wing. All she had was that Morse code transmitter, some backup system she jury-rigged from damaged components, and she used it now to tap out simple confirmations. 3 short bursts meant yes. 2 long meant no. 3 short, 2 long, 3 short meant she was still fighting. Hog 2-3, you're 10 miles out. Bagram has cleared the runway. Every piece of emergency equipment we own is standing by. You're going to make it. Morrison didn't know if he believed it, but he needed her to believe it. Needed her to keep fighting for the next 10 minutes, the next 10 miles, the next impossible second. The base came into view, lights blazing in the darkness, a beacon against the mountains. Vera dropped her nose slightly, adjusting her descent rate with throttle alone since her elevators were compromised. The asymmetric drag from the missing wing wanted to flip her, to send her tumbling into the earth, but she fed in opposite rudder with a precision that spoke of absolute mastery. Every input was measured, calculated, executed with no margin for error. One mistake and the physics would claim her. 30 tons of titanium and depleted uranium and human determination converted instantly into wreckage. Morrison watched her fight the aircraft every second, watched her shoulders tense and release as she made microscopic adjustments, and understood he was witnessing something that would be talked about in ready rooms for generations. This was the flight they'd use to teach people what was possible when you refused to accept limits. The runway lights stretched out before them, a golden pathway through the darkness. Vera lined up on final approach at an angle no flight manual would ever recommend, her remaining wing low to counteract the missing one, her good engine screaming as she used thrust vectoring to maintain control. The fire trucks paced her along the taxiway, ready to drench everything in foam the moment she touched down. Medical helicopters orbited overhead, their spotlights tracking her descent. Somewhere in the tower, someone was recording this for the inevitable investigation, capturing every impossible second for engineers who would later shake their heads and revise their understanding of what the A-10 could survive. Morrison keyed his radio one last time. "Hog 2-3, you're cleared to land. The whole base is watching, Thorne. Bring her home." 3 short pulses answered him. Then the Morse code went silent as she committed fully to the landing. Her remaining landing gear touched first, the tires shrieking as they grabbed pavement. For one beautiful moment it seemed like she might actually grease it, might make this impossible landing look routine. Then the asymmetric weight distribution asserted itself. The wingless left side dropped, grinding spar and fuselage against concrete in a shower of sparks that lit up the night. The aircraft slewed sideways, still traveling at 60 knots, trailing fire and metal fragments. The remaining wing dug in, crumpling as it absorbed energy, and the whole airframe began to cartwheel. Vera rode it out, hands still on the controls, steering through chaos with nothing but throttle and will. The A-10 rotated 180 degrees before the momentum bled off, ending up facing backward on the runway, its good engine still running, its broken body steaming in the floodlights. For 3 seconds, nothing moved. Then the canopy shattered outward as Vera Constantin punched through it, rolled across the fuselage, and dropped to the pavement. She stood there swaying, blood streaming down her face, flight suit torn and scorched, looking like something conjured from mythology rather than born from military aviation. The crash crews surrounded her, but she waved them off, staggering to the nose of her aircraft. She placed both hands on the bullet-scarred titanium, leaning against it like a wounded animal seeking support, and Morrison understood in that moment that she wasn't just thanking the machine, she was apologizing for breaking it. The medics finally got to her, easing her onto a stretcher despite her protests. As they loaded her into the ambulance, her eyes stayed locked on the A-10, watching the foam cascade over its broken body. Someone would later say that she was crying, but Morrison was closer and knew better. Those weren't tears of pain or fear. They were tears of rage that she'd been forced to destroy something so loyal, so true, something that had refused to quit even when quitting was the rational choice. The ambulance doors closed and she disappeared into the night, but her aircraft remained, spotlit and steaming, a monument to refusal. General Hawthorne walked the runway to see it himself, needing to confirm with his own eyes what the reports couldn't capture. He stood beside the wreckage, studying the sheared wing root where metal had been torn away by forces that should have killed her instantly. Studied the bullet holes that had somehow missed every critical system except the ones she didn't need. Studied the blood on the controls and the burn marks where electrical fires had raged through the cockpit. Then he turned to his operations officer and said quietly, "Get me her flight recorder. I want to know exactly what happened up there." The data told a story that was somehow worse than anyone had imagined. Vera had been 15 minutes into her close air support run when the first Zu-23 opened up from a concealed position. The Taliban had learned to wait, to let American aircraft commit to their gun runs before revealing their positions. Smart. Deadly. The tracers found her left wing immediately, walking up from the hardpoint and chewing through the main spar. Any normal pilot would have punched out immediately, taken the ejection seat ride and hoped the helicopter could reach them before the enemy did. But Vera had 6 Marines pinned down in the valley below, taking fire from 3 directions, and her gun still worked. The flight recorder caught her voice on the internal cockpit recording, calm and focused despite the master caution lights painting her instrument panel red. Hog 23 is hit, losing hydraulics, left wing structural damage. Marines, I'm staying on station. Her wingman, a lieutenant named Campos who'd been flying his 3rd combat mission, shouted at her to eject. The JTAC on the ground, a sergeant with the call sign Chaos, told her the same thing. Hog 23, we can evade and extract. Get out of here. Her response was pure Constantine. Negative, you move, you die. I've still got trigger. She'd stayed on that gun run for another 7 minutes, firing until her ammunition was exhausted, destroying 2 mortar positions and a machine gun nest while her aircraft disintegrated around her. The engineers would later calculate that she'd been flying with a 12-degree angle of attack just to maintain altitude, constantly correcting the aircraft's desire to roll inverted. Then, the wings separated completely. The flight recorder captured 1 second of silence, the pause of someone accepting their death, followed by her voice, tight but controlled. Okay, new game. For 90 miles, she'd nursed that broken warthog through mountain valleys, too low for a safe ejection, too damaged to climb. She'd used terrain masking to avoid further anti-aircraft fire, flying through canyons where the rotor wash of friendly helicopters couldn't reach her. When her primary radio died, she'd torn apart the backup navigation system and rewired it into a Morse code transmitter using a penlight, electrical tape, and the kind of field engineering that would have made her crew chief father weep with pride. She'd flown one-handed while she worked, the other hand maintaining pressure on the throttle, her feet dancing on the rudder pedals in a rhythm that never broke. The flight data showed microsecond corrections, constant minute inputs that kept the asymmetric aircraft from entering an unrecoverable spin. No autopilot, no computer assistance, just human hands and human will applied to thousands of pounds of damaged metal, forcing it to do something physics said was impossible. The general studied the data for 2 hours, then walked to the hospital where Vera was recovering. She had a concussion, 3 broken ribs, a fractured wrist, and a laceration across her scalp that had required 40 stitches. She was arguing with a nurse about discharging herself when Hawthorne entered. The room fell silent. Vera attempted to stand and salute, but the general waved her down, his usual granite expression cracked by something that might have been humility. Captain Constantine, I came to apologize. She blinked, confused. Sir, I declared you lost. I gave up on you. He pulled a chair beside her bed, this 2-star general who'd commanded thousands and sat like a man confessing sins. I didn't know, didn't understand what you were capable of. Vera was quiet for a long moment, her hand unconsciously moving to the bandage on her head. When she spoke, her voice was rough from the smoke she'd inhaled. It wasn't me, sir, it was the bird. The hog kept fighting, so I kept fighting. That's the deal. The general nodded slowly. The Marines you covered extracted safely, all 6. They're alive because you refused to leave. Something flickered in her eyes, relief, validation, the confirmation that the cost had been worth it. The A-10, total loss. The engineers say it's a miracle it held together as long as it did. They're already talking about studying the wreckage, figuring out how it survived, how you survived. Vera's jaw tightened. She deserved better. She had better, Hawthorne said quietly. She had you. He stood, and this time he was the one who saluted her, a gesture of respect that transcended rank and protocol. Rest, Captain, that's an order. When you're ready, we'll talk about your next assignment. After he left, Morrison slipped into the room with Reeves and 3 other pilots from the squadron. They'd been waiting in the hallway, maintaining the vigil that military families keep for their wounded. Vera looked at them, at the mix of awe and affection in their faces, and felt something shift in her chest. For years she'd fought to prove she belonged, to earn respect in a community that had questioned her at every turn. Now, in this hospital room with bandages and blood, and the ghost of her father watching from somewhere beyond the sky, she understood that respect wasn't given or earned. It was forged in fire, hammered out on the anvil of impossible choices, tempered by the willingness to sacrifice everything for people who depended on you. Morrison sat on the edge of her bed, careful of her injuries. The crew chiefs are fighting over who gets to paint your kill marks on your next bird. You've got 15 confirmed air-to-ground kills now. That's more than most fighter jocks get their entire career. Vera shook her head. Different game, we're not hunting, we're protecting. Still counts, Reeves said. Still matters, you matter, Thorn. The nickname hung in the air between them, and Vera remembered when she'd first heard it. 3 years ago, fresh out of flight training, trying to prove herself in a squadron that had never had a female A-10 pilot. The men had started calling her Thorn as a mockery, prickly, difficult, something that made you bleed if you handled her wrong. She'd worn it as armor, let them think she was tough enough that names couldn't hurt her. But after tonight, after everything, the name had transformed. Now it meant something different. Thorn, the part of the rose that protects the beauty. The defense that ensures survival. The sharp edge that keeps predators at bay. Her call sign had become a promise instead of an insult, and she could see in her squadron's faces that they understood the change. The night wore on. The pilots eventually left, returning to their quarters and their own processing of what they'd witnessed. Vera lay in the darkness, listening to the distant sound of aircraft taking off and landing, the eternal rhythm of a military base at war. Her body ached, but it was the good ache of survival, the pain that reminds you you're still alive. She thought about the Marines she'd saved, wondered if they knew her name, if they'd ever connect her face to the call sign that had covered them. She thought about her father, about the last time she'd seen him alive, climbing into his crop duster with a wave and a promise to be home for dinner. He'd crashed in a cornfield 40 miles from home, mechanical failure or pilot error. The investigation had been inconclusive. She'd been 12, and she'd spent the next 15 years trying to understand how metal and sky and human hands could fail so catastrophically. The A-10 had given her part of that answer. Metal fails, hydraulics rupture, wings shear off, but the human spirit endures. Her father had died because his aircraft had betrayed him. But tonight, Vera's aircraft had refused to betray her, had fought alongside her until its last rivet, and in that refusal was a kind of redemption she hadn't known she needed. Sleep finally claimed her around 300, and she dreamed of flight. Not combat flight, not the terror of anti-aircraft fire and missing wings, but the pure flight of childhood imagination. She soared through clouds that tasted like cotton candy and skis that never ended, and her father was there, flying formation off her wing. He didn't speak. The dead rarely do in dreams, but he looked at her with pride so profound it made her chest ache. When she woke at dawn, her face was wet with tears, but she was smiling. The investigation took 2 weeks. Military bureaucracy demanded paperwork, required every second of that flight to be documented, analyzed, and filed for future reference. Vera sat through debriefs with accident investigators, engineers, and a colonel from the Air Force Safety Center who kept shaking his head in disbelief. They showed her simulations of her flight, computer models that demonstrated why she should have died. Every simulation ended in a crash. Every model showed the aircraft entering an unrecoverable spin within seconds of losing the wing. But the actual flight data contradicted the models, proving that sometimes reality refuses to conform to theory. Captain Constantin, the lead investigator, said during the final debrief, "We're classifying this as a Class A mishap due to the aircraft loss, but we're also recommending you for the Distinguished Flying Cross. What you did wasn't just survival, it was artistry." Vera shifted uncomfortably in her chair, her ribs still tender. "It was just flying, sir, doing what needed to be done." The investigator smiled. "Captain, I've been doing this job for 20 years. I've analyzed hundreds of accidents and incidents. I've seen what happens when skilled pilots face impossible situations. Some freeze, some panic, some make one mistake and die. You flew a fundamentally uncontrollable aircraft for 90 miles while bleeding from a head wound, saved 6 lives before you started that flight, and landed the wreckage with enough precision that we could recover useful data from the instruments. That's not just flying. That's rewriting the definition of what's possible. The recommendation went up the chain of command, gaining endorsements at every level. The Marines she'd saved submitted their own statements, describing the moment when they'd heard her gun firing and known they'd live. The JTAC, Sergeant Chaos, wrote 3 pages about watching her absorb anti-aircraft fire and keep fighting, about the discipline and courage that kept her on station when every instinct screamed to run. Even her old flight instructors from training weighed in, remembering a determined young woman who'd outworked everyone, who'd studied aircraft systems until she could recite hydraulic pressures in her sleep, who'd been told a dozen times that she wasn't good enough and had responded by becoming exceptional. The medal ceremony happened 6 weeks later, on the same tarmac where she'd landed her broken bird. The entire wing assembled in formation, hundreds of airmen standing at attention while the sun blazed overhead. General Hawthorne pinned the Distinguished Flying Cross to her uniform, and Vera stood straight despite the pain that still flared in her ribs with every breath. The citation was read aloud, formal language that somehow failed to capture the truth of that night, and she thought about how words always fall short when describing the moment between life and death, the razor edge where skill and luck and will intersect. After the ceremony, a lieutenant from another squadron approached her. Young, probably 23, fresh from training with the same nervous energy Vera remembered from her own early days. "Captain Constantine, I'm Lieutenant Sarah Parker. I'm the first female pilot assigned to this squadron since you." Vera studied her, seeing herself 5 years ago, seeing the uncertainty and determination warring in the young woman's eyes. "How are they treating you?" Parker hesitated, then opted for honesty. "Some of them don't think I belong. They're waiting for me to fail." "Good," Vera said, and Parker's eyes widened in surprise. "That means when you succeed, when you prove you can fly this bird as well as anyone, they'll know it wasn't luck or lowered standards. They'll know you earned it." "Did you earn it?" Vera thought about 3 years of fighting for respect, of working twice as hard for half the recognition, of the night she'd flown a broken aircraft home and finally silenced the doubters. "Every damn day, and so will you." "But Parker," the lieutenant straightened. "Yes, ma'am. Don't fly to prove them wrong. Fly because you love it, because the mission matters, because there are people on the ground who need you. The respect comes later. The work comes first." Parker nodded, saluted, and walked away with something new in her stride. Not confidence, not yet, but the foundation on which confidence would be built. Vera watched her go and understood that her legacy wouldn't just be that impossible flight. It would be the doors she'd kicked open, the path she'd cleared for women who came after, the proof that skill transcended gender and determination could overcome prejudice. The squadron threw a party that night, an unofficial gathering in the maintenance hangar where someone had set up a grill and too many cases of beer. Vera attended despite her usual preference for solitude, understanding that some moments required community. The crew chiefs had painted her kill marks on a new A-10, 15 small symbols representing enemy positions destroyed, and they'd added something extra. A small thorn beneath her name, stylized and sharp, a badge of honor she'd earned in blood and fire. Morrison found her standing beside the new bird, one hand resting on the fuselage. "She's a good one," he said. "Freshly overhauled. They gave you the best bird in the fleet." "She's not mine," Vera said quietly. "I'm just borrowing her. That's the deal with these machines. We borrow them, fly them, bring them home. They never really belong to us." "Maybe," Morrison agreed, "but you belong to them. You proved that. Most pilots eject when things go wrong. You stayed with yours until the end." Vera turned to look at him, this man who'd been her wingman, her friend, her witness to the impossible. "She stayed with me first. That's what people don't understand. The hog saved my life as much as I saved hers. We made a deal up there somewhere over the Coringle. Neither of us quit, neither of us die. We kept that deal." The party continued around them, laughter and stories, and the kind of bonding that happens when people who risk death together pause to celebrate life. But Vera slipped away early, walking the flight line under stars that seemed impossibly bright. She found the wreckage of her old aircraft in the bone yard, already being stripped for parts and analysis. The sheared wing root was exposed now, the structural spar bent but unbroken, testament to engineering that exceeded its design specifications. She placed her hand on it one final time, feeling the cold metal, remembering the moment when the wing had torn away and she'd felt the aircraft lurch beneath her. Remembered the instant when she decided to fight instead of quit, to fly instead of fall, to trust that she and this machine could forge something impossible together. "Thank you," she whispered to the broken bird. "Thank you for not giving up on me." The wind carried her words away across the tarmac, across the mountains beyond, across the sky where her father still flew in her memories. And somewhere in that vast darkness, among the stars that navigated warriors home, Vera Constantin understood that she'd found what she'd been searching for since she was 12 years old. Not redemption for her father's death, that had never been possible, but proof that Constantin hands could bend metal to their will, that determination could overcome impossible odds, that love for the aircraft and the mission could carry you through moments when nothing else would suffice. She'd brought her broken bird home, and in doing so, she'd finally brought herself home too. The war continued without pause, missions launching and landing, but Vera Constantin's name had been carved into aviation history with the same precision she'd used to fly her dying aircraft. Years later, after she'd retired from active duty and taken a position training the next generation of A-10 pilots, she would stand in front of classrooms full of young aviators and tell them about that night. She'd show them the flight data, walk them through each decision, explain the physics and the flying and the precise throttle inputs that had kept her alive. But the most important lesson couldn't be taught from data or explained with diagrams. It could only be understood through experience, through the moment when you're alone in a cockpit with the instruments failing and the aircraft breaking and the choice between surrender and survival presenting itself with absolute clarity. "The aircraft will tell you what it needs," she'd say. "Your job is to listen, to trust, to refuse to quit even when quitting makes sense. That's the compact between pilot and machine. That's what separates aviators from people who merely fly." And always, in the back of every classroom, there would be at least one female pilot listening with special attention, understanding that Vera Constantin's impossible flight had been about more than survival. It had been about proving that competence transcends gender, that determination matters more than doubters, that the sky belongs to anyone willing to fight for it. The Distinguished Flying Cross hung in a frame in Vera's office, but it wasn't her most prized possession. That honor belonged to a piece of sheared aluminum, no larger than her palm, salvaged from the wing root of her old aircraft. She kept it on her desk as a reminder, as a talisman, as physical proof that sometimes the impossible is just the difficult viewed from a different angle. Lieutenant Parker, who would eventually become Captain Parker, then Major Parker, visited her years later and asked about that piece of metal. "What does it mean to you?" Vera picked it up, feeling its weight, remembering the howl of wind through the torn wing and the vibration of the aircraft fighting to stay airborne. "It means that loyalty runs both ways. I didn't quit on my bird and she didn't quit on me." That's all any of us can ask for in this life, someone or something that refuses to give up on us, even when we're broken and bleeding and missing half of what we need to survive. This medal kept its promise, so I keep mine by teaching pilots like you to do the same. Parker nodded, understanding in a way only another female combat pilot could. The challenges had lessened over the years, the doubts less vociferous, but they still existed, still required proving. Still demanded that women in cockpits work harder, fly better, demonstrate competence that men could take for granted. But Vera's flight had changed something fundamental, had created a reference point, a standard, a story that would be told in ready rooms forever. When someone questioned whether a woman could handle the stress of combat flying, someone else would invoke Captain Vera Thorne Constantin, who'd flown a broken A-10 90 miles home with nothing but skill and determination. The debate ended there, settled by evidence too powerful to refute. General Hawthorne retired 2 years after that night, but before he left, he made sure Vera received every commendation she deserved. The Air Force Cross was discussed but ultimately denied due to bureaucratic technicalities, but the Distinguished Flying Cross with Valor device sat in her record, permanent testament to her actions. On his last day in uniform, Hawthorne visited her one final time. "Captain Constantine, I wanted to apologize again for declaring you lost, for not believing." Vera smiled, the expression softening features that combat had hardened. "Sir, you made a rational decision based on available information. I was lost by every reasonable standard. I just chose not to stay that way." "That's the thing about exceptional people," Hawthorne said. "They don't accept reasonable standards. They create new ones." He saluted her, this two-star general honoring a captain, and the gesture carried the weight of everything he'd learned from watching her refuse to die. "The Air Force is better because you're in it. The world is safer because you wouldn't quit. That matters more than medals." After he left, Vera sat in her office surrounded by the artifacts of her career. Flight suits and patches and photographs of aircraft she'd flown, of missions she'd completed, of people she'd saved. But her eyes kept returning to that piece of sheared aluminum, to the physical proof that impossible is just a word people use before someone proves them wrong. Her father would have understood, would have looked at her twisted metal talisman and nodded, recognizing the compact between pilot and aircraft that transcends normal relationships. Would have been proud that his daughter had taken his love of flying and forged it into something that saved lives, that mattered, that would echo through generations of pilots who learned from her example. The general had declared her lost. The Taliban had counted her dead. The physics had demanded her destruction. But Vera Constantine had rolled home anyway, missing half her wing and none of her determination, and in that return had written a chapter of aviation history that would never be forgotten. She'd proven what Constantine hands could do when applied to impossible problems. She'd honored her father's memory not through perfection, but through persistence. She'd carved her name into the sky with the same precision she'd used to carve her way through the Korangal Valley, and that name would endure long after the medals tarnished and the aircraft were retired. Because legends aren't built from success alone. They're forged in the moments when failure seems certain, when survival seems impossible, when every rational voice says to quit and someone says no. Says I'm staying on station, says I've still got trigger, says I'm bringing this bird home no matter what physics says. Vera Thorne Constantine had said no to death and yes to the impossible, and the sky had answered by carrying her home. That was her legacy. Not the medals or the commendations or the respect she'd fought so hard to earn, but the simple, powerful truth that determination and skill and love for the mission could overcome anything. Even half a missing wing, even mountains full of enemies, even the certainty of death itself. She'd flown into legend that night above Afghanistan, and the legend would fly forever, inspiring pilots who weren't born yet, who would sit in classrooms decades hence and learn about the woman who refused to quit, who would touch that piece of sheared aluminum and understand that it represented something more profound than survival. It represented the promise that humans make to their machines, to their missions, to themselves, that we will fight until the last second, fly until the last breath, refuse to surrender even when surrender makes sense, that we will bring our broken birds home, no matter the cost. And in the silence of her office, surrounded by memories and metal, Vera Constantine smiled and knew that she'd kept that promise completely.